You might think the recent success of the Bob Dylan biopic A Complete Unknown, which recently garnered 8 Oscar nominations, as you can see in a prior video I did about those nominations here at The Curious Listener, might prompt Bob Dylan to roll out his mystique and his music in big, fancy, famous venues, right? To ride that wave of momentum into Madison Square Garden and the Hollywood Bowl and wherever else, which is exactly why old Bob is doing precisely the opposite, as he has been known to do for many decades now, defying expectations, right? Something that he himself, a reputation that he has poked fun at most, perhaps famously in his Music Care speech, when he taunts this idea that he confounds expectations. But one wonders how else to describe the venues at which he has announced a few forthcoming shows this spring in March and April, a few of which are mid-sized cities, but maybe still, even in their cases, not in the kinds of venues one might expect Bob to be playing at as he rides that wave of momentum brought on by the success of A Complete Unknown. But one of them is a venue so tiny and seemingly remote as to prompt yet again the question whether or not Bob Dylan is trolling us, as perhaps he has done with some frequency over the decades as well. These 4 shows that he recently announced occur first on March 25th in Tulsa, Oklahoma, at a place called the Tulsa Theater. Then he hits up Wichita, Kansas on March 29th at a place called the Century 2 Concert Hall. And here's where it starts to get increasingly a bit silly. There's a place called Mankato, Minnesota. If you didn't know about it, don't worry, neither did I, where he's playing the Mayo Clinic Health Systems Event Center. And then he's going to Green Bay, Wisconsin on April 6th. That Mankato, Minnesota show in his home state of Minnesota is April 4th. April 6th, he hits up a place in Green Bay, Wisconsin called the Weidner Coffrin Family Hall. Now, Mankato, Minnesota, Rolling Stone reports, is the 21st largest city in Dylan's birth state of Minnesota. The 21st largest city just in that state. The population is a mere 46,000, and the venue Dylan is hitting. Now, you really want to perk your ears up for this list of fabulous events at this venue that have occurred prior to Bob Dylan's forthcoming engagement there. They have included events like the Folsom Prison Experience, which, as you might gather, is a Johnny Cash tribute show. Appropriate enough, right? There is Boyd Holbrook's pass at Johnny Cash in A Complete Unknown, which I have praised again and again here at The Curious Listener. But then it's also held the Minnesota Valley Action Council's lip sync battle. And most fabulously, something called the Pork Congress. Yes, the Pork Congress, which is billed as the Midwest's best swine-specific trade show and education, designed exclusively for pig farmers and pork industry stakeholders. If ever there were a designation to eagerly chase down, it most certainly is as that of the Midwest's best swine-specific trade show. I don't know about you, but that definitely sounds like some high stakes street cred right there. And that's where Bob Dylan is playing one of the 4 forthcoming shows in March and April. Now, listen, I don't mean to dog on Mankato. It's a beautiful place. You can go to like Minneopa Falls. That's a pretty environs. You could check out 7 Mile Creek Park, one of the state's most treasured parks. Maybe you catch yourself like one of those foot-long trouts there, right? Sibley Park, you got some great hiking, some panoramic forest views. Just watch out for the skunks. Don't say I didn't warn you. Skunks. There are skunks. Take a dip in Lake Andrew, especially if hypothermia is what blows your hair back. You can check that out. But remote venues or smaller venues at which you wouldn't necessarily expect an American icon, a rock star, probably America's greatest living songwriter to perform. In the 2000s, if you'll recall, he did tour through minor league ballparks and state fairs. This was throughout the 2000s. I think he did some of those shows, in particular at the ballparks with Willie Nelson and John Mellencamp. So, it's not necessarily unheard of for Bob to perform at venues that one wouldn't necessarily expect him to seek out. But the more important thing about these forthcoming shows is a point that I hadn't thought a lot about in the great deal of coverage I've now done about A Complete Unknown, which is Should 83-year-old Bob Dylan, this man turns 84, I believe, on May 24th of this year, do any shows in 2025? Those shows, because of the success of A Complete Unknown, come with the likelihood that some new fans who are not well versed in the Bob Dylan live experience, they're going to show up at these shows most likely, and these shows might be bigger draws than they otherwise might have been, and those fans might be in for a bit of a shock or a rude awakening, as anyone who has seen Bob Dylan live, really ever, but perhaps particularly in recent decades, can attest. That fierce independence and unpredictability that Bob flaunts at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, as portrayed in A Complete Unknown, he has carried that streak with him into his live performances ever since. And many decades of live performances followed that pivotal moment at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, when he only then had come out with Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61 Revisited. These days, he's on what is popularly billed the so-called never-ending tour, a designation about which I'll have some comment in a moment. But he just as was the case that day, that summery day in Newport in 1965, he has never played to the whims or wants of any given audience. You can shout out requests all you want at a Dylan show. He is going to ignore you. Sometimes he'll go out of his way to mock you or even tell you to shut up, as I will discuss in a minute. There are a couple of relatively recent examples of him doing so. This Dylan in his 80s is every bit the rascal he was in his 20s back at Newport. Okay, Rolling Stone addresses this dynamic of any forthcoming shows that Dylan does at age 83 now, in the wake of the success of this biopic about him, brings about. Okay, Rolling Stone says this: the Academy Award nominated movie caused a huge spike of interest in Dylan's life and music. If new fans show up to these concerts expecting to hear Mr. Tambourine Man, Blowin' in the Wind, The Times They Are Changin', or basically any other song from the soundtrack, they are likely to leave mildly disappointed at best. And if they expect him to strap on a harmonica rack and play solo acoustic, they will leave incredibly disappointed. Yes, you are as likely to be disappointed by going into a Bob Dylan show expecting him to explore just one thread of his vast creative horizon as those folks were at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. He never stopped doing this to his live audiences. What he did in 1965 is who he is and who he has been ever since. Bob Dylan now is as unpredictable a live performer as he was 50, 60 years ago. Okay. So that expect the unexpected from Dylan's live shows. If you go in with that mindset, you might not leave disappointed. Now, with respect to Rolling Stone's comments about the set list, we don't necessarily know for sure. I mean, even Jim Mangold and Elijah Wald, the author of the book upon which his film is based, it's an excellent book called Dylan Goes Electric, were shocked and they both said so. In particular, Elijah Wald, he seemed especially surprised when Dylan went out of his way to tweet not too long ago kind words about A Complete Unknown, specifically naming Elijah Wald and Timothy Chalamet, praising the latter as brilliant in this tweet. So, he's warm enough to this film, over which he had a great deal of influence. I mean, he and Jim Mangold apparently sat at a table for days going back and forth about the script. Maybe he's warm enough to this film that he might be willing to indulge desires to hear some of the tracks that Timothy Chalamet learned to play, or for that matter, Monica Barbaro. I mean, she learned to play Bob Dylan songs as in her role as Joan Baez, like "Don't Think Twice, It's All Right." You never know. Anything's possible with Bob. That's why you got to go in, expecting anything to a Dylan show. That's always been the right mindset to bring to a Bob Dylan concert. His more recent set list last summer in 2024 underwent some overhaul. He had on this so-called Rough and Rowdy Ways tour, which I believe started in 2021. That record came out in 2020 when COVID made it impossible for him to tour in the immediate aftermath of that release, right? He played a lot of Rough and Rowdy Ways tracks for the first few years of that tour. Now, that record is excellent. This is not just this Dylan fan saying that. It is objective fact that Rough and Rowdy Ways, and when he was nearly 80 years old, coming out with that record in 2020, was released to widespread critical acclaim. As this little tidbit from allmusic.com indicates, they said of the record, at nearly 80, Dylan's pen and guitar case still hold plenty of magic. So he was playing a lot of Rough and Rowdy Way stuff. That record was really outstanding, and the opportunity to see him perform some of that fresh material live was a terrific one. But much more recently, last summer, he goes on this outlaw tour with the likes of Willie Nelson, Robert Plant, and with Alison Krauss. Of course, they've done multiple albums together. Um, he really dug deep into the vaults and shook up that set list. He abandoned entirely any songs from Rough and Rowdy Ways and started pulling out tracks like Under the Red Sky from the Dylan album of the same name from 1990, Shooting Star from 1989's Oh Mercy. But it was really the covers with which Dylan at that time, as recently as last summer, was making waves. He did covers of the Grateful Dead's Stella Blue, Chuck Berry's Little Queenie. These were the first times he ever in his life had played these songs live. So that was a way that he was surprising his audiences as recently as last summer. He also, and I loved this, was reintroducing to his set list tracks from a record that I consider to be his finest of the past 20 years, which is Tempest, that came out in 2012. He was playing tracks like Long and Wasted Years, Pay in Blood, Scarlet Town, or Early Roman Kings, each of which struck me as an instant latter-day Dylan classic when I first heard them 13 years ago. If you're going to listen to any Dylan record of the past 20 years to get a good taste of what he's capable of here in the later decades of his career, I definitely would turn you loose on Tempest before any other record, although every record that he's done over that period of time has at least a few masterpieces to enjoy. Tempest, I think, a little bit more than the others. So he also at this time made some changes to his lineup. He ditched drummer Charlie Drayton, replaces him with the legendary Jim Keltner, who I've seen play live behind Neil Young multiple times. Also parted ways with his multi-instrumentalist Donnie Herron. The comment that Rolling Stone makes about Dylan playing guitar is an apt one. Dylan has not played much guitar live since 2002, so if you're new to Dylan live and you're going to see him because you loved A Complete Unknown and you can't believe that you've got the opportunity to still see him live, maybe, as is the case, you didn't even know that Dylan was still alive. I mean, there are more people who don't know that than you might realize, and you're like, wow, he's still touring too. I got to check this out. Well, don't go there expecting to see him play much guitar as he does as Timothée Chalamet does, depicting him in A Complete Unknown. He switched largely to keyboards as long ago as 2002, and as the years have progressed, he plays much of the show sitting at his keyboard, and that's what you're going to get from Bob these days live. Okay, he'll sometimes bust out the harmonica. It wasn't too long ago that he, for some reason, started playing a wrench. He was banging a wrench on the microphone at a syncopated rate to like create some kind of beat with the. Yes, this really happened. I can link to this in the description. Again, there is no shortage of surprise to a Bob Dylan show. He may be 83. That doesn't mean that he has stopped toying with his audiences in any way he could think of. And that was one very recent way that he did so. This is why it was quite notable when Dylan played a surprise set at the 2023 Farm Aid event with some of Tom Petty's Heartbreakers band, in particular Mike Campbell and Ben Montench on keyboards. It was notable that he played guitar throughout that set. I think he only played a few songs there, and he played it beautifully, by the way. I should link to a video of that as well. Well worth a look. Another thing that people who are just going to a Dylan show for the first time after seeing and enjoying A Complete Unknown should keep in mind is, Bob doesn't sing, he croaks. And this has been the case for decades. Don't expect to hear him sounding anything like the Dylan of the days that A Complete Unknown depicts, or Dylan as he sounds through the vocals of Timothée Chalamet. Dylan hasn't sounded like that since then. If you listen to any of his more recent records from the last 20 or 30 years, sounds a bit more like a bullfrog or a chainsaw hacking down an oak tree. Tom Waits, later day Tom Waits type vocals. Earlier than that, it was a very nasally Dylan that you got throughout the 1980s. So again, be prepared for that. That could be a shock if you aren't initiated to latter day Dylan. Also, and this is particularly quirky, expect to have your cell phone put on lock at any of these shows. You might think you're going to get to go there and snap videos and pictures and stuff, but you're not. And Dylan has very strict protocols in place to ensure that you don't have access, that kind of access to your cell phone while he's performing. He threw a tantrum about this in April of 2019 when he abruptly halted his show and said to the crowd grumbly, "We can either play or we can pose, okay?" Because someone was videoing part of his performance. He then, by the way, fell backward on stage and then gathered himself, got up again, and continued the show with "It takes a lot to laugh, it takes a train to cry." But clearly, this is a real pet peeve for Bob, and expect to part ways with your cell phone at a Bob Dylan show these days. Also, expect him to have very little to say throughout the show, if anything. And there's a piece in Variety in which I think they put it well. Bob Dylan rarely speaks in his concerts beyond the thank you, so when he says even something trivial, people listen, and when he suddenly breaks with form to defend a controversial figure, they lean in even more. Now, he did that in November of 2023 at the Beacon Theater in New York City when he publicly defended Rolling Stone founder Jan Wenner, who was under a tremendous degree of pressure at the time, had been banished from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame after coming out with a book called The Masters. And he goes on this sort of interview tour promoting the book, ends up in the hands of a New York Times interviewer who says, "You know what, Jan, there are pretty much no women artists or artists of color in this book of so-called masters of rock and roll. Why is that?" And Jan Wenner made an embarrassingly ridiculous comment about how there were no women artists or artists of color who had anything, quote, articulate to say on a, quote, intellectual level. You can imagine how well that went over, given that, some of the women artists we're talking about here are like, I don't know, Joni Mitchell, Patti Smith, who won a National Book Award for her memoir Kids, Bill Withers slash Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Curtis Mayfield had nothing articulate or intellectual, Jan, to say about rock and roll. I did a couple videos about that topic at the time that you can go back and see here at The Curious Listener. That got him in a lot of hot water, and Bob, who goes way back with Jan, who had been interviewing Bob since at least the late 1960s, publicly defended Jan and really made news in doing so because he hardly says anything, no less goes out of his way to make any controversial statements at his own shows. 2 years earlier, there's something about the Beacon Theater, I guess, at the same venue. Someone shouted out a request for Pretty Boy Floyd, which Dylan has performed and does a wonderful job with. Dylan's response to that was to say that that person was at the wrong show. You can go see Springsteen on Broadway if you want that. I think it was at that same show when he was performing. I forget what song. I believe from Rough and Rowdy, the Rough and Rowdy Ways album, and he grumbles into the microphone, "Shut up!" while someone is shouting out a request. So, that's rare form Dylan. He doesn't often engage with his audiences. He's all business. He's buttoned up. He might say thank you and plays set and get out. And that's about it. So as far as expectations go for his shows, that's another one to bring to the experience. Don't necessarily expect Bob to say much except for the lyrics that he croaks into his microphone, which he may or may not bang on with a wrench. Okay, that's what you're in for with 83-year-old Bob Dylan. I've seen Dylan 3 times in my life. I saw him at Jones Beach. I saw him in the Tampa area at a place called the Sundome near the University of South Florida. But first, I saw him on November 1st, 1998 at Madison Square Garden, which is one of the most legendary Bob Dylan shows ever to be experienced. He was on fire as a live performer for a somewhat brief moment in the aftermath of having won the Grammy Award at the 1998 Grammys for 1997's release Time Out of Mind. And all of a sudden, he was reinvigorated by the sight of much younger fans shouting the names of newer songs like From Time Out of Mind in the front rows of these audiences. That's something that Dylan hadn't experienced for a long time. I mean, people shouting for him to play Cold Irons Bound and Love Sick and Not Dark Yet and Million Miles and Can't Wait and all those great songs from Time Out of Mind, it really breathed some new, fresh life into Dylan and his always talented, incredible backing band. Dylan was on fire that night at Madison Square Garden in New York City. I am so fortunate to have seen Dylan in top form live because he is such an unpredictable performer in terms of quality and inspiration. Some shows he just doesn't really seem to care much. Other shows he's just on fire for sometimes for reasons that can't be explained or understood. Well, he was on fire that night. That band at Madison Square Garden came out absolutely blowing the roof off of Madison Square Garden with an incendiary cover of a rendition of "Gotta Serve Somebody" from Bob Dylan's Grammy Award-winning 1979 album of the same name. You might get that Dylan at 83, but at his age, it's a bit less likely. Although what you're always going to get with Dylan is a great backing band. His backing band is second to none, really. So you're going to, if you go to the show wanting to just enjoy some top-notch musicianship. From Dylan on keyboards, by the way, he always has had a kind of spooky aesthetic and approach to the piano and to keyboards that he's flaunted throughout his career. But his backing band, particularly Eric Gagne on bass, is just really amazing. Now, I mentioned earlier, you might also see these tour stops branded as a so-called never-ending tour. And that's kind of a made-up media thing that Dylan himself has gone out of his way to dismiss as long ago as the liner notes of his excellent acoustic, Grammy Award-winning acoustic record, World Gone Wrong, in 1993, all acoustic covers on that album. The liner notes of which he said this about this whole so-called never-ending tour phenomenon. Don't be bewildered by the never-ending tour chatter. This is Dylan himself writing this. There was a never-ending tour, but it ended in 1991 with the departure of guitarist G.E. Smith, who has given some wonderful interviews about his experience playing behind Bob Dylan on those tour stops when I think G.E. Smith was part of the Saturday Night Live house band. I should link to some of those in the description as well. G.E. Smith, a great guitarist who is a huge fan of Dylan, describes bursting into tears backing Dylan on tracks like Tambourine Man Live. Really wonderful musician and huge Dylan fan in G.E. Smith. That one's long gone, Dylan says of the so-called never-ending tour, but there have been many others since then. The Money Never Runs Out tour in the fall of 1991, the Southern Sympathizer tour in early 1992, Why Do You Look at Me So Strangely tour, the European tour of 1992, the One Sad Cry of Pity tour, Australia and West Coast American tour of 1992, the Outburst of Consciousness tour in 92, Don't Let Your Deal Go Down tour in 93, and others, too many to mention, each with their own character and design, Dylan says. Nevertheless, his touring schedule has continued to be described as the so-called never-ending tour. There are people who have tracked how many shows on this so-called never-ending tour he's done, just to give you a taste for how unrelentingly Dylan has toured in the later decades of his career. He played in this so-called never-ending tour period, which ostensibly began in June of 1988. I think it's technically tracked back to June 7th of 1988. He played the 2000th show of this so-called never-ending tour on October 16th, 2007 in Dayton, Ohio. He played show number 3000 of the so-called never-ending tour on April 19th, 2019 in Innsbruck, Austria. So that's 1,000 shows in 12 years. There in his 70s, okay? The man gets out and he plays in workmanlike fashion. And as I said, he's got one of the most talented backing bands in the business, and it is the talent of that band that he is credited for his ability to tour as incessantly as he has. He's recorded all of his later day records of the last 25 years with these guys. Love and Theft in 2001, Modern Times in 2006, Together Through Life in 2009, even that Christmas album in 2009 as well. Tempest in 2012, which I already mentioned. Shadows in the Night and Fallen Angels and Triplicate, those like Sinatra cover records, the crooning era songs that he did. The Shadows in the Night is excellent, by the way. It might sound weird, Dylan singing Sinatra, but you got to check that album out. Shadows in the Night, in particular, is a really spooky, beautiful record. And Rough and Rowdy Ways in 2020. It's the same backing band for the most part that has backed them up on all those studio albums, and that's why the musicianship on those records is so stellar and why all of them have been released to critical acclaim. So I think my bottom line is this. Again, it occurs to me as I see him announce these few shows and Rolling Stone lending a caution to them, especially as it relates to newer fans, to the live Bob Dylan experience, which often has been a peculiar one. Take these shows on their own terms. Take them for what they are not for what you hope they would be, or what you expect them to be. Take these shows on their own merits, okay? Um, those people who went into the Newport 1965 Folk Festival expecting Bob to be a certain version of himself were disappointed. If you go into these shows expecting Bob to be a certain version of himself, you too are bound to be disappointed. He has continued, to demand that mindset of his live audiences ever since 1965. That's unlikely to change now as he chases down his 84th birthday this coming May. So bring the right mindset to one of these shows if you're a new convert to the live Dylan experience after seeing a complete unknown. And unlike Rolling Stone's Caution, which anticipates some disappointment among that set, you might actually come away from those shows grateful for the opportunity at having seen a living legend, really still at the height of his powers, thanks to, in no small part, to that great backing band that he's toured with for decades now.